in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a US Air Force Security Forces airman, so a military police. At the time, my girlfriend was at work and it was a swelteringly hot day to begin with. It later turned to thunderstorms. My buddy Nick, who's another military cop, and I decided to go and explore some back roads and get out of the town heat. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads and some are actively used. Many are totally forgotten and overgrown. Nick and I spent many of our days starting off driving down roads that we knew, then finding roads that we didn't know, and driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating our way back to paved roads. On this particular day, with the storms clouding over ahead of us, we set off on a road that we'd never been on and we began to drive into the mountains. After driving for around an hour, we hadn't seen or heard of any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed a strange stillness and almost immediately realized that there were no birds, hardly any insects and no squirrels. There were certainly no other people here. On the far side of this meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. This table was very odd, however, it was painted bright orange. It was much larger than any other picnic table that we'd ever seen before. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remembered being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees as the aspen grow extremely close to each other. We parked by the table. I helped out at the passenger side of the truck to go and check it out. Now, I'm not very tall, I'm about 5'5". Regardless, this table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning that I'd literally have to climb up to sit on them. As I was looking at this table, Nick called me over to the truck and I noticed that he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I didn't know what he was looking at. I then noticed that there was a splash of colour that was completely out of place from the thick trees. A small one-man tent was set back in the trees, about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread and felt certain that there was somebody in that tent, and if we could see that tent, they could definitely see us. There were no other campgrounds in the area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely somebody wouldn't be camping out this far on their own. At the very least, it would have had to have been a very strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear anything coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled out. No reply. We were both feeling completely on edge at this point. Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving the strange area, but we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in the tent? What if somebody had got kidnapped? Stupid, I know, but we both thought it. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. That way, if we needed to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting at the wheel. My heart was pounding. I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over the place. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothes. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I'd seen. As I left though, I started to hear him yelling. "Let's go, let's get the hell out of here." Not knowing why he was yelling at me, I immediately broke out of the trees. I saw a beat up old Ford truck on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately jumped into the passenger seat and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by two men. A third person was also leaning against the window. It was obvious there was quite a few of them in there. As we drove across the meadow, the driver then attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and quickly accelerated the way we had come. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around back on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and although I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we did eventually hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still don't know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police and they promised to send out a trooper to check it out. However, the next day I received a call from the trooper stating that the campsite, backpacks and all the woman's clothing was gone. Though he could tell that people had been in the area, the strange table was still by the thick aspen. That was the last that I ever heard of it. This happened just over 2 years ago, and it seriously made me rethink about camping alone. I was with 2 friends at the time, and I worry about what would have happened had I been by myself. 2 friends and myself were on a cross-country road trip to Roswell. New Mexico was one of our stops. We were going to be camping for most of the trip, so we got a site at Bottomless Lake State Park. About 20 minutes outside of the city, we did our thing going into town and headed back to our campsite at around sundown. Everything seemed pretty standard at first. There were some neighbours camping down the road and we could hear their music. While this was going on, my 2 friends read and wrote in their journals by the lantern. I drank a couple of beers while taking long exposure photographs of our campsite. The music eventually died down. My friends got tired and went to sleep. After I got the shot I wanted, I did too. Now, I awoke and fairly disorientated, somewhere in the state from the transition of light to deep sleep. I heard crunching around my tent. Not knowing if I was dreaming or not, I kind of sat up and tried to figure out what was going on. I was sure it was just an animal, but I started to hear it again. This time it was closer. The sound wasn't just closer, it was directly outside of my tent. Unmistakably, I knew that there was somebody out there. The hair on the back of my neck then stood up as I knew something was up. There was a moment that I thought it could have been a ranger, who knows, maybe our registration was messed up, or maybe we left the headlights on the car. I asked out, "If anyone's out there, can you please make your presence known?" Nothing. "Hello, please identify yourself. It's important." Nothing again. I sat there frozen with the most intense sense of fright that I've ever felt, and it was dead silent. I calmed myself by laying back down, hoping that it was just my imagination, and began closing my eyes. From what I could tell, within the next 5 minutes the footsteps started moving around my tent. I shot back up and knew there was somebody out there. At this moment, something surreal happened that I can't explain adequately to express my sense of fright. As I sat there, open-mouthed and silent, the end of my tent started to be lifted up by the person outside. I screamed for my friends in their tent, screamed for them to wake up and that there was somebody out here. I felt really hectic. My friends were disorientated. I was disorientated, and from then on, I didn't see or hear anything. My friend basically started yelling back at me to stick my head out of my tent and check it out, but I was absolutely terrified. What if I stick my head out and they've got a gun or something? I did finally work up the balls and saw nothing. No one. We got out of our tents and into the car. I told them everything. They seemed concerned yet skeptical. I was adamant that I saw something and something had happened. We then decided to shine the headlights of our car into the direction of our tent, which was kind of surrounded by these rocky hills and a dried up riverbed. As we scanned the rocks with our lights, another light hits a rock right behind our tent. We decided that it would be a good idea to leave our stuff and get a motel room, so we headed to Roswell at about midnight. The whole night I felt kind of stupid. I know I was really scared. I kept trying to tell myself that I was just dreaming, or it was just a raccoon, or that I'd seen too many horror films. Well, I kinda joked about it, watched Cops on some crappy motel TV and fell asleep. When we woke up in the morning and we went back there, my fears were unfortunately confirmed. We rolled up and nothing seemed to be out of place. Nothing was stolen or moved. I found this pretty calming and I started to settle down. We started picking up our things and I began to take my tarp off. That's when my friend yells out loud, "Well, there's something really weird here," and signals me over. The elastic and bungee cords that hold the rain fly up were cut clean through. I mean, literally, somebody had to use a knife to do it. The tent was brand new. I went back over to my tent to see if the same had happened and was immediately drawn to the fresh boot prints that circled my tent. There were footprints that were obviously not mine. The scary thing is, even to this day, I still have no idea who or what did that, or if they're still out there, or if it's even safe for me to go out camping alone. A few years back, my girlfriend and I, having hiked several other parts of the Appalachian Trail, decided we wanted to give the southern proportion of Virginia's trails a shot. It's about 166 miles long and runs through George Washington and Jefferson National Forest from Brannock County to Pearisburg, Giles County. This is definitely one of the more remote and less traveled parts of the trails, which is exactly what we wanted. We gathered our gear and made our way to the start of the Virginia Creepy Trail to begin our journey. We had planned our journey to end at Damascus and figured that by the time we got there, we would be more than ready to go home to our beds. It was early October and the change in leaves and colours of everything was amazing. The air was nice and cool, perfect weather for hiking with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful, just a typical hike, but like our last couple of nights in there, things got weird. Now on this proportion of the trail, you're supposed to camp on the trail or design shelter. We didn't really want to run into other people and we didn't want anybody coming up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore these suggestions and find our own little spot off the trail. A little searching around and we found a spot. It was a little ways off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, made some food, and talked for a while, then went to bed. Somewhere at around 2 AM, I was awoken by my girlfriend shaking me and telling me, "Get your gun quick, somebody's outside our tent." She informed me when she woke up that she heard what sounded like somebody right outside her tent who was running a knife or something along the side circling us. While hiking, I always carry a 1911 and a judge with me. You never know exactly who or what you might run into when such a long hike is in such a remote place. I got the judge out of my backpack and was silently listening for any sounds. At first there was just nothing. There was only breezes blowing through the trees and then I heard it. Snap, crunch, snap. Someone or something is walking in the woods behind our tent. I got the flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. Our fire had went out, so it was nearly pitch black outside, only illuminated by the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked it out. I didn't flick the flashlight on right away as to not give away that I was out of the tent, and I didn't want the shining to be a beacon of my location. Instead, I waited and heard more noises. A few minutes later, there was the same snap and crunching sounds. I then quickly turned on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I then saw somebody move behind a tree. I yelled out and told them to go away and that I was armed. I kept the light on the area with my gun drawn and slowly approached the area where I thought I saw somebody. Then, from my right, I hear what sounds like somebody running through the woods. I spin and face my light that way, and then, from the original spot where I heard who or whatever it was, saw somebody take off into the woods. There's no way I'm giving chase, so I quickly go back to the campsite. I tell my girlfriend what happened and ended up sitting up on guard outside the tent until it was daylight again. In the morning, I looked around for a bit of a sign for exactly who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print in the soft mud not far from the tent. It wasn't mine or my girlfriend's. This freaked me out as it confirmed that somebody, perhaps more than one person, was lurking around in the dark. I kept it to myself though because I really didn't want to freak out my girlfriend. At this point, we were pretty deep in and we still had 2 days to go. That day, we walked a little faster than normal and covered as much ground as possible. When it come time to set up camp, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place a tent and a small overhang and prevent anybody from coming up on us. The whole day up to this point, I felt like we were being followed. I had no confirmation of this as I hadn't seen or heard anybody else, but this was just a gut feeling I had. We set up camp and made food, then I retreated to the tent. I gave my girl the 1911 and kept the judge right next to me. I then assured her that if I did sleep, I would have one eye open. After a while, she did drift off to sleep and I stayed awake listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours, just waiting to see if there was anything going to happen. At some point, I guess the exhaustion caught up with me and I drifted off. I awoke sometime later though to what sounded like somebody going through the outside of our tent. I grabbed my gun and woke up my girlfriend, hushing her to be quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see some silhouettes against the tent. There was really somebody out there. I was getting kind of annoyed at this point and I yelled at them, "We're armed, get the hell away from here." They dropped what they were doing and bolted. I come out of the tent, gun drawn, ready to shoot somebody. Our stuff was thrown all about the place. They had rummaged throughout all of our stuff. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction of whoever it was that had fled. There was a creek nearby and I walked down to the edge. This is where I saw that there was a small trail running along the side of it. Down the creek I could see a light. It looked like a lantern the way it flickered. I then saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the woods. I told my girlfriend to stop hacking up whatever she could and that we were leaving right this second. We packed up everything of value, left the tent and a few other items and hopped back onto the trail in the middle of the night. I kept hearing people talking off in the woods and hearing branches for quite some way. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to see if anybody was coming up behind on us. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still miles away from help. We hadn't seen another hiker the entirety of our time there. I really felt like this could be dangerous. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. As I rounded a corner, I turned around and saw somebody step out onto the trail and just stand there watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up and there was barely any light. I couldn't make out any features, just a silhouette. I stopped and looked at them for a second and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently watching us and then turned their back and walked around into the woods. We picked up the pace again and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut told me that they were still there for quite a ways. We eventually reached the end of the trail and we got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car. Extremely exhausted, we made it out to the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for some crazy cannibal people. Well, this is what I pictured in my head the whole time that we were there. I have no idea who they were or what they wanted. I'm sure it wasn't somebody just messing with us. It almost seemed like whoever it was lived out there. There was no signs of any other camps or anything. The not knowing is really the scariest part for me. I went to high school with a guy. We'll just say his name is Bob. Bob and I were never close but sometimes hung out in the same circle. He was in band and I was in drama. Bob was always a little off. I think he had a learning disability and maybe that resulted in him being socially awkward. Anyway, by sophomore year he was dating a friend of mine, so I got to see more of him. By junior year he dropped out and tried to get a GED. That's the last I heard of him, at least for a while. Fast forward to 2 years later after graduating, Bob calls me up and out of the blue asks me to go camping with him and a friend of his that I don't know. He says that he knows a spot that is totally secluded and would be hiking 5 miles a day. He really tries to sell me on this. He insists it'll be awesome fun and that we'll bond well. As I listen to him, something in the pit of my stomach says no, don't do this. Now, because of never being especially close to him and not seeing him for 2 years, I thought that this was weird and I declined. The following November, Bob is on the news because he had killed his partner. He worked for an armoured van service and stolen the money in the armoured van. There were news updates about him fleeing out of the state. He eventually got caught on a routine traffic stop. I believe his case went to trial, and this is where his journal entered into evidence. The prosecutor said that Bob wrote that he and his friend, the same one that was going to go camping, hatched a plan to become professional assassins. I believe that the camping trip that he invited me on was a way to get me out into a secluded place. Then he and his friend could practice how to murder somebody on me. After spending the whole day swimming in the river near the campground, everybody in the family was exhausted, except for me. It was still horrendously hot outside, so I decided to go to the pool and cool off. At that point, it was around 7:30 at night. As a rather socially awkward 17-year-old, I was super happy to see that nobody else wanted to go to the pool. I'd been swimming around for just a few minutes when I heard a gate open. I didn't have my glasses on at this point, but as far as I could tell, an older man entered the pool area. It was kind of sad that I wouldn't have the pool to myself anymore, but whatever. It was open to anybody on the campground. For the next 15 minutes, I just lunged around in the water, enjoying the fact that I wasn't sweating like a pig, and generally ignored the guy that was swimming at the other end. I started to notice that he was getting increasingly closer to me. Now, I was in the deep end of the pool, so I just brushed it off as him, and maybe he was waiting to get into the deep end. At this point, I wasn't very nervous because I'd been in the pool by myself loads of times and never had a problem before. It wasn't until he was just a few feet away that I started really getting weirded out. He was close enough that I could finally see his face. He looked about 50, he was smiling at me. I shot a quick smile back at him and immediately started swimming to the other side of the pool, but he followed. When I got to where I could touch, I turned around and asked if I could help him with something in the most annoying voice I could muster. It didn't really deter him though. He smiled again and said, "Maybe you can help me. I'm supposed to be staying at one of those cabins, number 15. I can't find it anywhere. Can you help me?" This instantly made all the alarm bells in my head go off. All of the cabins were lined up in a row just a couple of 100 feet from the pool and clearly marked with their numbers, and there were only 10 cabins there. Cabin number 15 didn't exist. I just told him that no, I couldn't help him, and climbed out of the pool to put my shorts on. I made sure that I could see him the whole time as he also exited the pool once again and followed me to wherever I went. This is when he turned and looked at me and said, "You all by yourself here? Pretty thing. You have beautiful red hair. I'd love it if you'd help me find my cabin. I think it's just off the road there." He then pointed over to the side of the campsite that had nobody there, nothing but forest for miles and miles, and it was actually the road that led out to the place. I said to him, "Get the hell away from me," and I turned and sprinted as quick as I could. I didn't even bother looking behind me. I began crying and I could hear that he was close to me. I did eventually manage to get away, and I'm not sure where the guy went, but it's made me never want to go camping again. Okay, so I'm a guy, and about 11 years ago when I was 8, me, my mum and my brother all went on holiday to Australia to visit some relatives on my mum's side of the family. They lived in the rural parts of Victoria, and to give a basic summary of the area, they lived on a farm. The house was surrounded by various fields. When facing the houses on the left side, you could see that there were 2 fields, and then on the far side of these fields was a high wooded area, as well as a dirt track running through it. My grandparents, who were the relatives living there, would often go on nature rambles through the forest to spot the wildlife. My mother, being a dedicated bird spotter, often dedicates some of her time to go off with Lisa, my girlfriend's brother, into the forest and look at the wildlife. We must have been walking along the dirt track for around 10 minutes, taking pictures of various animals we had seen. We passed by a line of motorbikes and around 7 bikers having a barbecue. One of the bikers politely smiled at my mother and she responded with a simple "good evening." As we walked past them, one of the bikers approached us and asked us where we were going. We told them where we were going and they informed us that they had been camping in that area for around 2 nights. They told us to be careful as people had been shooting game in these forests. These people apparently had aggressive dogs on them and we were told to be careful. Around 15 minutes later, I'd spotted an old barn and I dashed off to go and explore it while my mother and Lisa observed the birds. I didn't tell them where I was going. As I approached the barn, I saw 3 large dogs tied up outside. They were Rottweilers and they seemed incredibly aggressive. They were on chains and barking and snarling a lot. I didn't really think much of it at the time. I assumed they were for hunting, but looking back, Rottweilers aren't just hunting dogs. There was also an old mattress on the floor outside which appeared to be covered in brown stains and some other weird stuff. I was around 3 feet away from the mattress, but the smell was unbearable. As I was going to turn around to return to the others, I saw a man emerge from the barn. The image of this man is one of the few things I can clearly remember from this day. He's very tall, about 6'4", and wearing a blue striped suit. The strange thing about him was that he was wearing a large top hat. His clothes seemed very worn and his face, the parts of it that weren't covered by his brown beard, were red as if he'd been working out in the sun all day. I remembered the man smiled and approached me. I asked him if he was a magician, to which he replied, "No, I look after the dogs. Do you like dogs?" I told him I did. This is when things started getting weird. He began to approach me and asked if I wanted to come inside and have my picture taken with the dogs. I politely refused his offer and said that my mum would be looking for me. He then grabbed my hand tightly and said that it would only take a second. At that point, I heard my mum shouting at him, demanding to know what he was doing. She had come looking for me. The man quickly let go and just seemed scared by the fact that he had been spotted doing this and stared at her. She asked him again, in which he continued to stare. He didn't say a word. My mum immediately grabbed me and quickly got me and Lisa away from there as quick as possible. We got about halfway there and I turned around and told my mother the magician was following us. She turned around and sure enough, he was walking right behind us, quickly. My mother screamed at him and asked what he wanted. He didn't reply again, simply continuing to power walk towards us. At this point, my mum started walking even quicker to try and get away from him. The next part of the story is mostly blurry to me. I remember my mum gasping, picking me up and sprinting full pelt with me screaming for help. My mum tells me that the man had begun running towards us and managed to grab my leg. She said that Lisa jumped on the man's back and scratched all across his face before he threw her on the floor. My mum then apparently kicked the guy, grabbed Lisa and threw me over her shoulder. I remembered we slowed down shortly after where she had to catch her breath. We continued trying to walk away, only for the magician to show up again from the bush area. As my mum began to panic, he started running at us again. The man was sprinting after us with no hope of stopping. We were nearing the area where the bikers were camping and my mum screamed for help. 2 bikers emerged from the trees nearby and my mum screamed, "That guy tried to kidnap my son." The magician then turned around and immediately bolted in the opposite direction. One of the bikers pursued him, but unfortunately, the magician had a head start. I remember that the bikers were incredibly nice, and I soon forgot about the strange man after one of the bikers let me sit up on his motorbike, with my mum and Lisa in the sidecar. The guy took us to the nearest town and dropped us off at the police station where my mum filed a report. After that, he gave us a lift back home. It was really nice. I never got to thank him at the time as I didn't really understand the situation, but I owe a lot to him. I used to run a Cub Scout pack a few years ago, and one weekend we were camping at a Scout Association site. At about 2 AM on a Saturday morning, I was awoken by one of the boys screaming. It was loud, I mean really loud, and really terrified screaming. I ran out to my tent and ran as fast as I could to where the boys' tent was. A row of dome tents with 4 boys in each. The screaming suddenly stopped. I was looking for a tiger or something, dragging a boy out and starting to devour him or something. The screaming was terrifying, but there was just silence. No other kids had woken up, but I'd been joined by the other two leaders, equally worried and confused at the same time. I couldn't believe that the other boys hadn't woken up and nobody was even crying, just pure silence. We still had the same number of boys in the morning. It never did happen again, and I never found out exactly who or what it was. Two days after graduating high school, my two best friends and I decided to take a camping trip on a mountain frequented by the locals. I was going with two of my friends, Brian and Greg. They were both 2 years older than me and had taken their trip to celebrate their graduation, and figured that they'd do the same to introduce me to my college age years. We packed up all the necessities: tents, chairs, horrible light beers, everything. It was nearing dusk and we began hiking up the camping area, which was about 4 or so miles from the base of the mountain. We set up our camp and started drinking on the beers that we had and burning hot dogs in an attempt to cook them on the fire. Eventually we passed out at about 2 AM. Not long after drifting off though, something snapped me out of my sleep. I was still pretty intoxicated, but I could make out what sounded like music coming from outside the tent. I assumed it was Greg or Brian's phone going off and ignored it. I rolled over. It was at this point that I realised that I no longer had my blanket or pillow in my tent with me, and opened my eyes. I then also realised that I was no longer in my tent. I was in something that had just a tarp over it and it looked very makeshift. My buzz was instantly replaced with full-blown panic as I broke into a sweat. I then peered out of the side to try and figure out where the music was coming from. I then saw a cassette player sitting in the grass about 10 feet away from the tarp, when the music that was playing sounded like a homemade recording of a little girl singing the church Go Tell on the Mountain, accompanied by, I guess, was an offbeat xylophone. The only other defining feature at that campsite was a clothesline at one end of a tree. There were 3 white dresses hanging from it and they swayed slightly in the breeze. The whole thing was unsettling as hell. I was still trying to make sense of what was going on when I heard walking in the forest about 50 yards away. I froze, not wanting to believe what I was experiencing, hoping that I could just wake up and I'd be back in my tent. Unfortunately, there was no such thing. The rustling slowly got closer to me. The tape abruptly clicked and come to an end, and the rustling becomes sprinting. I then tore off down the mountain, stumbling a few times, ripping my knee open on the trail. I didn't even feel it at the time, just because of the adrenaline. I don't know how I managed to make it back to the base of the mountain where we had parked. I locked myself in the car and waited until the morning. I guess I managed to fall back asleep because I was awoken by Greg tapping on the window. He and Brian gave me some more stuff about how scared I was for not being able to stick it out the whole night in the mountain. I let them rag on to me because I figured it'd be a lot easier than explaining the truth to them. I didn't want to revisit myself either, honestly. It wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I dared to ask a question that had been nagging me. I couldn't help but wonder how they'd figured out that I'd gone back to my car. I asked Brian when we were hanging out playing video games a couple of nights later, and he told me that they'd got my note and then just assumed that I'd got scared off and went back to the car. I asked him what note he was talking about, as I definitely had no recollection of leaving one. He swore I did and claimed that he still had it in his camping bag. After rummaging around a few minutes, he found a paper that simply said, "Out walking." I nodded and said that I guess I must have wrote it in my sleep or something. He then laughed and crumpled it up and tossed it towards a garbage can. It's been 5 years since that night and I still can't explain the events of that camping trip. I went to high school with a guy. We'll just say his name is Bob. Bob and I were never close, but sometimes hung out in the same circle. He was in band and I was in drama. Bob was always a little off. I think he had a learning disability and maybe that resulted in him being socially awkward. Anyway, by his sophomore year he was dating a friend of mine, so I got to see more of him. By junior year he dropped out and tried to get a GED. That's the last I heard of him, at least for a while. Fast forward to 2 years later after graduating, Bob calls me up and out of the blue asks me to go camping with him and a friend of his that I don't know. He says that he knows a spot that is totally secluded and would be hiking 5 miles a day. He really tries to sell me on this. He insists it'll be awesome fun and that we'll bond well. As I listen to him, something in the pit of my stomach says no, don't do this. Now, because of never being especially close to him and not seeing him for 2 years, I thought that this was weird and I declined. The following November, Bob is on the news because he had killed his partner. He worked for an armoured van service and stolen the money in the armoured van. There were news updates about him fleeing out of the state. He eventually got caught on a routine traffic stop. I believe his case went to trial, and this is where his journal entered into evidence. The prosecutor said that Bob wrote that he and his friend, the same one that was going to go camping, hatched a plan to become professional assassins. I believe that the camping trip that he invited me on was a way to get me out into a secluded place. Then he and his friend could practice how to murder somebody on me. I was out camping with my mum and then 6-year-old brother when a white pickup truck pulls up into our campsite. 3 or 4 guys get out of the truck, all wearing small, bright white lights attached to their hats and blind us from seeing much of their faces. They approach my mum and start asking her questions about who we were and what our plans were that night. My little brother started whimpering and stopped eating Doritos that he'd normally happily eat. And I also got the impression that my mum was really creeped out. So the men do eventually leave after about 5 minutes and told my mum that they were official campground employees who were just making sure that everybody was alright. Their truck certainly didn't look official and they weren't wearing anything that would suggest that they were more than just regular creepy dudes wandering around being nosy. My mum told my brother and I to get in the car and take a few of the essentials like clothes and food. We then had to go to my grandmother's house and leave quickly. We left the tent and campsite giving the illusion that we were still there. The next morning,